Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Pakistan's relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, those relations are currently in the headlines for various reasons. And nevertheless, it seems pertinent to review those relations at this time and the mutual benefits to both sides of having these good relations for these past many years. And to discuss that further, we're now joined by two former ambassadors of Pakistan who are joining us now from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. We're joined now by Ambassador Ashraf, Jehangir, Qazi, and Ambassador Ghalib, Iqbal. Thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out of your busy schedules to speak to us today here in Scope. Ambassador Iqbal, I'd like to start with you, if I may. There are various aspects, of course, over these relations between the two countries, and they're all equally as important: the economic, the cultural, the Islamic connections, et cetera, et cetera. How important are these relations? How mutually beneficial are they, in your opinion?
I guess Pakistan and Saudi Arabia has always lived together. Probably Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries, in addition to a few other countries from GCC, which have come forward and helped Pakistan not only financially, politically, diplomatically, but also economically. So these are the things which we need to, because in bilateral relations, things happen. At times, even the friendliest of friendly country is not going to support you on certain aspects. Our relationship, it's not only based on financial benefit to each other or security benefit to each other, but I think the reverence Pakistani people feel towards Saudi Arabia because of Makkah and Medina, that is a very important factor, and we should keep that in mind. And Saudi Arabia hosts a big number of Pakistani expats in Saudi Arabia, and they are doing different jobs over there. Yeah. They primarily support Pakistan financially at the time of your budget, because they send the remittances from there. So all said and done, I think Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, they have enjoyed very good relationship.
Ambassador Qazi, what are your thoughts on this? Because, we can obviously talk about, as I said, mutual relations and the benefits to both sides, right? But as Ambassador Iqbal there mentioned, there are a lot of Pakistanis who work currently in Saudi Arabia and have, of course, for these many, many years, benefiting, of course, the Saudi economy and the nation there as well. How important do you think that contribution has also been, as well as, of course, the many contributions, be it in the security aspects or otherwise, on behalf of Pakistan to Saudi Arabia?
So thank you very much for inviting me to join this discussion. I agree that Saudi Arabia is a very important friend of Pakistan. Our relations are extremely important for Pakistan and indeed for Saudi Arabia. And as was mentioned just now by the ambassador, our relations with Saudi Arabia have been in many fields, and they have given us very important support. There's no doubt about it. However, even among friends, there's a distinction to be drawn. There are friends who sort of help us because of their larger strategic interests and who appreciate, the value of Pakistan's friendship understanding. And a prime example of that is China. And Turkey, for instance, and to a certain extent, certainly Malaysia. On the other hand, there are friends who have been friends and have rendered, important services, but not to put too much of an emphasis on it. No, there's a certain pound of flesh that is asked for in return. Now, Saudi Arabia, while it has been of importance in all the fields that have been mentioned and all. In fact, the value of our rupee is being supported by the amount of money that they place at the disposal of our banking system. And generally speaking, they've given us, money when we've been in dire straits, etc. And we have also contributed to the security of Saudi Arabia. But what has been happening in recent years is that there's a kind of attitude towards Pakistan. Pakistan is a poorer country. Developing country in the economic terms. Saudi Arabia, while not a developed country as such, is an extremely rich country. And it has no problem paying its bills. And, there's massive resources. Oil resources are, the largest in the world, etc., all of that.
Right.
But, of course, the desire that Pakistan should side with Saudi Arabia against countries with which it has differences and all. And Pakistan must make that choice or suffer the consequence. This happened also recently. I know Yemen is we all know what's happened, and Yemen has never harmed Pakistan. And Pakistan handles that issue with some finesse. There's no doubt about it, However,
Ambassador Qazi, I'm going to cut you off just because we're quickly running. I do apologize for cutting you off, sir. I just wanted to get one final word before letting you both go from Ambassador Iqbal. Ambassador Iqbal, we can of course talk about the benefits and the differences between these two sides, and of course that's as you both have mentioned, natural in any such relationship, right? But do you believe that Pakistan will and has achieved, or in the very near future will achieve, balanced relations in that regard, right? Where it is able to then secure its national interests within this very, very important relationship that we can all agree upon?
You see, Pakistan, we should understand one thing, that these are the times when we are reverting back to a bipolar world. Okay, so the camping is either the Chinese or the American camping. Then we are going to see that India and the GCC countries are going to have better relations amongst themselves vis-a-vis Pakistan. And at the same time, we need to see one more thing, that, yes, of course, and when these new camps and alliances are being built around the world, then we need to look at the future. We need to see 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or maybe 50 years from now, what the situation would be not only in this region, but in the Gulf and Saudi and the Western countries also. Yeah. All these things put together, we must ensure that our relationship with the GCC countries stays on track. If it does not stay on track, then we are the one who are going to lose everything. Okay. And we are not going to benefit out of this acrimonious relationship with Saudi Arabia. So that's why I'm saying that we need to remain engaged with Saudi Arabia in a very positive manner. In diplomacy, insult your friends. And
Indeed.
The strategic friends should never be insulted. So when these new alliances are being made now, we need to be cognizant of that for the future, because the future generations are going to run this place and they are going to run this country. So it's what happened in the past has happened. It's already happened. We can learn from that. Indeed. But we need to formulate our policies in a way that Pakistan and Saudia's relations, and not only Saudi, I would reiterate that Pakistan and GCC relationship should stay on track. And it should, in fact, improve. We have seen, we have been providing ample security to Saudi installations, and we have been providing ample security to Saudi's different requirements. But at the same time, Saudi has also been more than forthcoming in providing us a lot of benefits in return. So it's a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo based on the religious affinity the two countries have. It should continue, and it should be ensured that the relationship between Pakistan and Saudi stays on track. We cannot afford to lose a country, a friend, a brother like Saudi Arabia at this particular time when the new alliances are being made around the globe.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word. Appreciate both Ambassador Qazi and Ambassador Iqbal for their time today, for speaking to us there from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad, sharing their thoughts with us on relations between Pakistan and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. As I said in my introduction, those relations in the news right now. Of course, rifts and disagreements between friendly countries are also very much common. It's all now important to see how these countries work through it now towards the future, and what now happens in the coming days, months, and years as well. These relations have always remained strong in the past, and no doubt will in the future, as Pakistan seeks to preserve its own national interests and to have balanced relations with all countries around the world, be it neighboring countries or regional countries such as Saudi Arabia or others as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UK's reaction to asylum seekers seeking, again, asylum on its shores. This has recently become a controversy within the country ever since the Home Office, Priti Patel, more specifically, has brought this up, especially with the French, with channel crossings. I believe around 4,000 people or so over the past year or so have sought refuge in the UK by crossing via the channel. Now, all of this is coming up at a time when, of course, as we know, the refugee crisis has been going on for a number of years now because of wars in North Africa and the Middle East, etc. Nevertheless, there's just been this deportation flight. There have been 14 people placed on a flight back to France and Germany. The UK arguing that France needs to do more to stop these asylum seekers from crossing into UK territory. The French and the English seemingly now discussing that behind the scenes, trying to come to some sort of a deal about that. But it's also worrying about the language that is being used, right, to describe these human beings who are seeking, safety from persecution of all sorts from around the world, or for a variety of other issues, possibly as well, all legitimate, or of course that need to be investigated at the very least according to the laws that exist internationally. Nigel Farage referring to them as an invasion of people, and now certainly, as many people would agree, this is not an invasion at any level. This is, a small trickle of people entering into the UK if we compare it especially with the other countries in Europe also, as well as, of course, around the world. We can arguably say that there are many other countries around the world that host several-fold more refugees as well, and do so seemingly with less harsh rhetoric towards them. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Neil Jameson, who is Emeritus Director and Founder of Citizens UK. He's also the chair of the new NGO UK Welcomes Refugees. He was also party to founding the Safe Passage International. He's joining us from London. Also joining us from the British capital is Sarah Singer, who is a senior lecturer in refugee law at the University of London. Sarah and Neil, thank you both for your time today. Neil, let me start with you. What do you make of this latest flight that took off? 14 people on board, 19 people's cases, I believe, were deferred. Nevertheless, this, seems to be because of all the pressure right now that is being placed by the government, by Priti Patel more specifically, and others who do not want this quote-unquote migrant invasion.
Personally, I regret it, and I think most people do in Britain. The Home Secretary obviously has a job to do, but there is a situation where basically, I think, in most newspapers, apart from one, it's a gross overreaction to the nature of the challenge. There is no safe and legal route for refugees to reach the United Kingdom. We are an island. The only way they can get to us is in a desperate situation is by potentially drowning, of course. Nobody comes to the UK to claim benefits. The fact that the government has acted so quickly at the time of so much else going on. There are so many other issues that the government should be focused on, to do with COVID, of course. Nearly 45,000 people have died as a result of this terrible virus. And the numbers of people who have come at the moment is 0.006% of the British population, which is a tiny, tiny number, particularly, if I may say so, in comparison to Pakistan, that you have done a fantastic job with 1.4 million registered refugees in your own country, and Bangladesh, of course, which has 1.1 million refugees. At this stage, the number of refugees who are registered in the United Kingdom is grown a bit. It's 280,000, but nothing like the challenge of the poorer nations of this world.
Yeah.
So I think that Britain's history of rescuing and providing sanctuary is a good one, and it brings a shame to this country for us to react in this way at such a time of other much more important issues.
Sarah, what do you think is at the root of all of this, right? Because we now have a new government role, and I'm reading it now because it's a bit of a mouthful, the Clandestine Channel Threat Commander, which is aimed at, quote, making the channel route unviable for small boat crossings. I mean, all of this just seems like, again, it goes back to that use of invasion, the word invasion by Farage.
Yes, I think the political context has a lot to bear on this. As you all know, we recently had a Brexit referendum, and we're due to formally leave the European Union at the end of this year. And one of the key mantras surrounding the Leave EU campaign was securing our borders. And so I think the government now finds itself in a situation where leaving the EU isn't securing the borders, in a very visible way that they would have hoped of. So they've taken a very authoritarian stance, bringing in the military, for example. And I agree with you very much that the language surrounding this is extremely concerning. Even if we disregard these very vile adjectives such as invasion, you see in the British media and in the politicians' rhetoric, these people being described as migrants. Whereas in fact, many of them are fleeing torture and persecution. They're in fact refugees, they're asylum seekers seeking safety. And the reason that they've been forced to take these irregular routes to get to the UK is due to a lack of regular routes to arrive. The UK has suspended its resettlement scheme. It's suspended its scheme for unaccompanied minors to be able to enter the UK. If regular routes were available, then people wouldn't have to resort to these measures.
Let's talk about for a moment regular routes then, Neil, because if I may play devil's advocate for a moment, I imagine the government and those on the other side would say, listen, if we make it almost a free-for-all, and I'm just using that term here just for argument's sake, that would just open the doors, right? That would open Pandora's box. How do we then control our borders?
Sure, yes, I would say I'm not arguing for that at all. But like Sarah, I do believe that it's possible, and all decent countries should have safe and legal routes for people fleeing war and poverty and climate crisis to be able to come, particularly to join their relatives, of course. One of the many pluses of being part of the EU is that there is a rule in the EU, which is one reason why the government should not be doing what they are doing, that family reunion is possible. If people are trying to meet, particularly if they're under the age of 18, which is why the plight of young people who are stuck in Greece, of course, is a terrible indictment on European countries, that according to something called Dublin III, if they have families in Europe, they should be able to go to their family and then claim asylum. Most countries are not recognizing that. Safe Passage International is the one organization that is working on this, and the government has consistently said, oh, well, when we leave and Brexit is over, we'll come up with something very similar. Well, they haven't done so yet. So basically, there is an argument that the government is flouting European law. Clearly, as Sarah is also saying, after January next year, when we are formally out of the EU, we have to, those of us who don't believe in the present position the government is taking, make sure that there is still a liberal and a reasonable and a compassionate route for people fleeing what they are fleeing, the tyranny and poverty and, as I say, climate crisis, to be able to come to Britain, as we have done in the past. We have a proud tradition of doing this, but frankly, the present position and the present language and images coming from the UK, I am ashamed of.
Sarah, I imagine you would be pessimistic about what may happen vis-a-vis laws towards refugees come the end of this year in the UK?
Well, it's very unclear what the law regarding refugees, particularly Britain's membership of the common European asylum system, is going to be post-Brexit. But the indications from the government is that they're seeking to work with France to strengthen border controls there and retain some version of the Dublin scheme, which Neil referred to, but in a way that makes it easier to return asylum seekers to other European countries. I think it remains to be seen whether the government will be successful in negotiating a deal like this, particularly given the numbers of refugees and asylum seekers hosted in the UK are far lower than many other European states, particularly France and Germany.
Neil, we've had, as you said, in your first answer, you said that a lot of Britons do not agree with the government's rhetoric and the government's stance on these asylum seekers at this time. We even had Ben & Jerry's, which is a famous ice cream brand there in the UK, speaking out against this, and there's been that back and forth now seemingly between the Home Office and that company. But do you think that it's time then for even companies such as an ice cream company to start speaking out? I mean, is that the way to almost shame the government into doing the right thing?
I think that's so wonderful. And if you've looked at Ben & Jerry's rebuttal, it's very, very clever. Today, Gary Lineker, a hero of the football world, has said that he is so ashamed at this conversation that he and his family will sponsor a family through the government scheme. On the plus side, the government is very keen on something called community sponsorship of refugees. And the organisation I'm chair of, which is UK Welcomes Refugees, is specifically interested in this route, which it is possible. A few other European countries are beginning to do it. It comes from Canada, which is a fantastic example of how civil society can receive refugees, help resettle them. These are, if you like, refugees that the UNHCR have said are genuine and so on. So civil society doesn't decide who comes. The government still decides who comes, but civil society resettles them. And there are more and more groups beginning to do this, including now Mr. Lineker and his family. Although actually families can't do this, there have to be teams that do this. So the global resettlement scheme has an aspect of hope for the future, as is sponsorship, because it's something that we can all do in the UK. And also very good that a lot of the Muslim communities are beginning to do this, clearly because this is one way of fulfilling the obligations of Islam to receive and resettle people, many of whom, of course, are Muslim, particularly from Syria.
So, Sarah, does that kind of pressure, do you think work when it comes to government policy in this regard? Or do you think that, the entire Brexit campaign and all of the above, that the government will really side with that instead of, the growing pressure possibly from more grassroots movements, from companies that want to speak out about something that doesn't, meet their conscience?
Well, I think that there is certainly potential for public engagement and support of these people to influence government policy. But really, I think at the root of this, the government in its approach has in effect given itself rope to hang itself, because I think we should be clear about the fact that there is no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker, right? Many asylum seekers have to enter countries in an irregular manner because of a lack of regular routes. And if a lot of this furore and hype is surrounding the irregular status of these people, allegations that they don't have valid protection claims, then a key way to address that is to put in place routes that they can have their protection claims assessed, either in the UK or in the countries in which they're located before they move on to the UK. And in that way, people will have the opportunity to have their protection claims assessed, and the UK can accept people who it has determined has valid claims. And in that way, it can show that it has control over its borders, right, while at the same time maintaining its international obligations to those who are fleeing persecution and conflict. But the current approach of cutting off regular routes, forcing people to take irregular journeys, simply puts the government in a position where it looks as if it's out of control, and it's forced to adopt these authoritarian, over-the-top measures.
On that topic of irregular routes, because both of you have mentioned it, Neil, there is talk of human traffickers, right? And that's been something that, as you well know, keeps coming up in discussions both in the UK and across Europe, I believe, as well, and in other countries also, about how human traffickers, and they certainly do take advantage and do abuse in many ways a lot of these asylum seekers, those who are seeking safety from persecution or any other such abuse. How does one deal with that, right? Because that's now an entire criminal network seemingly around the world.
You deal with it exactly the way we're arguing, through a safe and legal routes for people to come. They don't need, smugglers would immediately evaporate if it were possible to do, as Sarah was suggesting, for people to be able to come if they have a valid reason, legitimately. Smugglers, there will always be, and I imagine there have always been smugglers who will capitalize on people's distress. A way of responding to that is a government, in Britain particularly, reviewing what they're doing and seeing there is another way. And they did do that to their credit when the Syrian refugees were such a plight in Syria, and received 20,000 over the last 5 years of Syrians who've been resettled here under David Cameron's leadership, that was. But it was a very different country at that time. So, yes, smugglers will always be with us. What you need is a government and laws that allow people to be processed properly, to be safe when they are threatened with death and famine, and then indeed for the right numbers, people to come here and settle in this country where there is plenty of room.
Sarah, I wonder then, how does one then, plan out laws? How does one enforce laws then to both go after human traffickers and smugglers, people smugglers, as Neil there mentioned, as well as, possibly open up routes which would be legal? And then thirdly, if I may add this on, not to confuse you, but, there would always, I imagine, be concern about those trying to get into the system by taking, advantage of it, right? Undue advantage, that is. Those who possibly are just economic migrants for the sake of being economic migrants or refugees, however you want to term it. Because I would think that is the argument that is used most against these asylum seekers coming in.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there has been media attention over the last 20 years or so on the figure of the so-called bogus asylum seeker. And these are people that, the British public are concerned may not have a genuine protection claim. And I would say, well, the key way to address that is to give these people access to a means to have their claim assessed so it can be determined by a competent decision maker whether they have a valid protection claim or not. And ways that could be put in place is by strengthening the asylum system in the UK, by making provision of humanitarian visas so that individuals can come to the country and have their asylum claim assessed, and indeed enabling people to make claims in other locations, such as in embassies in third countries. Strengthening this system will help to overcome some of the concerns that people have in that area.
There's even talk, I believe, on part of the Home Office to send in Navy warships to the Channel, right? And a lot of people are worried that if that starts happening, then, an ex-Home Secretary, I believe, has said that may very well then result in a lot of these asylum seekers actually drowning at sea or in the Channel. And that in and of itself would also be a headache, would it not, for the government?
Well, it would be if there was an argument, and many of us believe there is, that would be breaking the law for the situation to be so dramatic that the Royal Navy has to get involved. That's at a time of war that usually happens. This is not a war. This is a crisis across the world, mostly climate-driven, definitely driven by dictators and others. And as I say, I think Britain's reputation until very recently was pretty good on receiving people, particularly in the build-up to the Second World War, where we took 10,000 children with no rules whatsoever. Not particularly popular by the government, but nevertheless civil society rose to these occasions. It's my experience, and I've got 30 years' experience of this, that people mostly do the right thing when they understand the situation. If they don't understand the situation because the leadership is using the negative language and indeed Royal Navy ships because the threat looks so terrible, then that does confuse people's natural instinct to be kind and to be able to do something rather than just watch these things happen and see people drown. Obviously, if the Royal Navy were responsible for the death of some refugees, that would be another crisis for the reputation of the British government.
I'll give you the final word before I let you both go. At a time of COVID-19, right, with the pandemic as well, that's added pressure, economic pressure as well on this government, job losses, layoffs, et cetera. Though those are also occurring, and those are also realities in many countries, or in every country, really, if we're honest, around the world. So, that's an added argument, is it not, then, to having more people coming in, even if they're just a few, even if they're just trickling in? That's something. How does one exactly address that? How does one deal with that? How does one prove that this will not, in fact, take anyone else's job?
Well, I think the answer to that, and of course there are health and security concerns around the COVID pandemic at the moment. The key thing that says to me is we need to avoid people taking irregular routes to get into the country. And the way to avoid that is by undercutting the business model of human smugglers, providing regular routes so people can be properly assessed, they can undergo health screenings on entry to the UK, or indeed they can have access to protection assessment in the location that they're currently based. I mean, the more that you militarize this and the more that you try and make it difficult for people to cross bodies of water, that simply pushes people to undertake more dangerous journeys via more risky routes. And we saw that particularly across the Mediterranean in 2015-16, when people were forced to take what's called the North Mediterranean route to reach Italy. And we saw the mortality rate of these people skyrocket. And we don't want to have a similar situation on the English Channel.
Very well. It was a final word, but we appreciate both Neil and Sarah for their time today, for putting this in context for us. You know, the message that both of them consistently gave throughout their answers is that, you know, we need to have those regular routes, open up those legal routes for people to actually come in as asylum seekers or refugees into the UK, and then, of course, have their claims properly investigated, at this time. But nevertheless, when we have these irregular routes, which are the only routes at this point in time for people to come to the UK as asylum seekers or refugees, then that then creates the domino effect of human traffickers and people smugglers. Nevertheless, there's no way, of course, of completely shutting down that sort of business, but nevertheless, that would make it a lot easier to control that sort of thing. This talk of an invasion, of clandestine threat channel commanders, of sending in Royal Navy warships to deal with the situation, it all seems possibly like a political deflection from the way that the government may have mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic. That's one argument for it. On the other side, of course, there is Patel's argument that she needs to secure her country's borders, and she needs to do her job as cabinet minister who is responsible for securing her country's borders. Nevertheless, is this the way to go about it? Is the UK really under invasion by refugees and asylum seekers at this time? As Neil there said, many countries around the world have several-fold those many refugees and asylum seekers within their borders and learn to treat them with significant dignity and host them for many, many years at a time. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss something that Donald Trump said at a private fundraiser event, where he mentioned that a new nuclear deal with Iran would happen within 4 weeks of him being re-elected, if he is, of course, in November of this year. That seems like a very confident stance for Donald Trump to be taking, certainly, especially considering that right now his country is, in fact, pushing for a vote at the UN Security Council to indefinitely impose an arms embargo on the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why then would Iran be forced or be even willing to come to a new deal with the United States? Is this following that theory, which is spoken of sometimes in politics as strong men being able to, in fact, come to a deal more easily than, in fact, to countries that are seeming to do so peacefully or in less, dramatic or rhetoric-filled ways? Let's discuss that a bit further, if we may. Now, we're joined by Barbara Slavin, who is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. She's joining us now this morning from Washington, D.C. Barbara, thank you very much for your time this morning. What do you make of this? I mean, is it just an off-the-cuff remark by Donald Trump? It seems like a very specific kind of promise to be making, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think we should pay too much attention to it, frankly. The President of the United States says odd things all the time that turn out to be not true. And this is very much off the cuff, very much wishful thinking on his part. As you know, the Iranian government has refused to talk to him at all unless the United States returns to compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with the nuclear deal. And I've seen no evidence that that's going to happen. So I would really not put too much faith in this.
Nevertheless, Barbara, if we're looking at, just on-the-ground realities in Iran, right? I was just reading a report before coming on air that, just household prices or housing prices, have gone up 46% because of inflation rates, et cetera. And, those are all realities, right, on the ground in Iran right now. And we have, of course, sanctions already in place at this time. Does any of the above, do you think, pressure the Iranian government to possibly go out seeking a better deal with the U.S.?
Again, I think, the situation is very bad, but Iranian leaders can read the opinion polls as well as anyone else. And I think they're going to wait until our presidential elections on November the 3rd. The hope, I presume, in Iran is that Joe Biden will win, in which case a Biden administration has promised to return to the nuclear deal if Iran returns to compliance. So why would they negotiate with Trump now? Certainly they're going to wait for November the 3rd. And you yourself mentioned this effort at the UN to try to extend the arms embargo, which is, the lifting of that embargo is the last remaining achievement of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So it makes no sense for them to return to talks or promise to return to talks now.
Barbara, I had a conversation with another Iran analyst just about a week or so ago, and he mentioned that it seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Donald Trump may foresee that Biden might win at the end of this year, right? So it seems that there is also this effort to almost make it such that the situation is such that there isn't really actually a recourse back to the original JCPOA as we currently understand it. Is it possible for Donald Trump to make the situation that bad where there isn't, again, a way to regain that sort of trust between these two nations or to even regain that deal as originally planned by the Obama administration?
Well, that certainly seems to be the intention of some of his advisors. Certainly, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has made that very clear. But, even if they, quote unquote, snap back sanctions, which is an extremely dubious movement since the United States is no longer a participant in the deal, even if that were to happen, President Biden can reverse all of that and return to the agreement. So my sense is that Iran is going to wait for our elections to see what happens. And if it's a Biden win, then they will proceed in the expectation that the U.S. will return to the JCPOA.
But there's also, if we're completely honest, Barbara, a lot has happened, right, since the U.S. walked away from this deal. We've had the assassination of General Soleimani. We've had those attacks on Saudi Arabia. We've had those attacks on the ships. The list is really quite endless. The drone, the list really is endless. So do you think within that reality that a hypothetical President Biden can do what a President Obama did before the U.S. walked away from the deal?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the deal still exists. It's 150 plus pages. I think the real question is whether there's a possibility of anything more, any broader diplomacy with Iran, which was certainly a hope back in 2015, or whether, frankly, this is it and this is the maximum that can be achieved between the United States and Iran. And that's something we really won't know until next year. Also, there's a kind of a brief window. As we know, Iran has presidential elections next May or June. So there is a brief window when the Rouhani team is there to return to compliance. Frankly, at this stage, with everything that's happened, I think that would be an achievement in and of itself.
Indeed. I was in fact going to ask you about that because that conservatives have now taken over the Iranian parliament, right? That they've won overwhelmingly seats in the parliament. So that would make life a lot harder for President Rouhani if he were to want to return to the deal, I would imagine, with a possible President Biden. Within that entire reality, right, as was spoken of during President Ahmadinejad's time, can the two countries really still learn to get this done?
Yes, I think they can. And look, Iran has been through a terrible experience with sanctions. I don't foresee a normalization of relations between the U.S. and Iran, but I think it's still possible for some understandings to be reached. And I'm looking, frankly, to the region to begin to address its problems with the quiet support of the United States. We've already seen some efforts at mediation by the Pakistani leader with the Saudis and the Iranians. I mean, we can see more of that, certainly, from the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. We had a phone call from the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates with Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. So there's a lot that the region can do on its own to reduce tensions. We have an Afghan peace agreement that appears to be proceeding, if certainly not perfectly, but does appear to be proceeding. So I would look for a Biden administration to support regional efforts at de-escalation in addition to a return to the JCPOA, and then we'll see where that can go from there.
Very well, Barbara. There's a final word, but we would sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to share your thoughts with us this morning. That was Barbara Slavin speaking to us there from Washington, D.C., putting into context, of course, Donald Trump's quite likely off-the-cuff remarks, as she correctly there pointed out, at this private fundraiser, saying that, within 4 weeks of him being reelected, if he is so, at the end of this year in November, that he would come to a deal with Iran. Now, that's quite a bold claim to make, quite a specific promise to make as well. We remember the one thing that I will point out is that from day one, even before he became president in this tenure, Donald Trump's one message that has remained consistent is, in fact, his Iran policy. That's the one policy we cannot say has not remained consistent. So is he serious? Is it even possible? Does he know something that we don't know about behind the scenes talks even with the Iranians? We don't know any of the above, of course. Does he feel that the Iranian government is under enough pressure that it would be forced to come to the negotiation table with him? As Barbara there correctly said, the Iranians have so far publicly at least said, no, we're not going to discuss with the United States further about the JCPOA unless it comes back into the fold of the JCPOA and lifts the sanctions as were promised within that nuclear deal. So, of course, it's a wait-and-see game. And can President Biden really just snap all of this back in the sense that bring it all back and for him to make it all okay, seemingly, especially considering so much has happened since the U.S. walked away from the nuclear deal with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and a whole host of other issues as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.